Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to see you this evening on a rare sunny day in London. And it's my real pleasure to welcome Chris Phillips here tonight. But before we get into the book and everything, just a few words of housekeeping. For those who might need it, the bathrooms downstairs in the base room. In the basement, in the event of a fire, we go out the front door, or there is actually an emergency exit at the top. So we're here to launch this book at a moment of conflicts in the Middle East, and of course I know that many of you here tonight will be thinking about Gaza, the West Bank, but also the other areas of the Middle East that have been sucked into the quagmire since the 7th of October. Of course, the attacks in the Red Sea, attacks between Israel and Iran, rocket attacks between Iran and Pakistan, Israeli attacks on Syria. It goes on and on. So we are obviously at a very dangerous moment. I've been saying that for quite some time. I hope one day to be able to have an event here soon where we don't have to talk about this. So it is actually very topical and germane to actually pan out away from just the issue of Palestine to look at these conflicts. And I have to say, it's here on sale tonight. This is the book that Chris Phillips is launching. It's available for £13.29. Discounted rate this evening. Is it £18 normally?
£18.99 normally.
£18.99, so almost £19.
Get on while I
So thoroughly worthwhile. I've read it, and it's. I think you were saying you had to do, is it 8,000 on 10 conflicts, and I'm sure that many of you will be expert in various of those conflicts, but very few people are expert in all of them. I certainly learnt a great deal, and it's thoroughly worthwhile, and looking at some of the commonalities and some of the differences. And I think a theme of your book is that we should not oversimplify these conflicts. Chris is a professor at Queen Mary. He's written a book on Syria, and I think that's really in the genesis of that book that Chris and myself met, discussing the horrors of Syria back in those days. And also, you edited a very good book on British Middle East policy as well. So this is book number 3, is that right?
It's actually number 4.
Number 4?
Yeah,
I've missed one out.
My PhD book.
I missed out your PhD book, I'm very sorry.
No one reads those anyway.
So book number 4, in which he has turned his eye to the broader region. So without further ado, he's going to be on the record in terms of his opening remarks, and then we'll have Q&A, and that will be Chatham House rule. So, Chris, thank you for coming here to Caabu tonight. Really looking forward to your comments and reflections, even now after everything that's happened, since you wrote this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Chris. Thanks ever so much for inviting me to come and speak here. I've always been a huge admirer and supporter of Caabu's work, so I'm delighted to be able to be here and talk with you this evening. I'm going to talk briefly about... Oh, here we go. Well, does this work? John, I'm just going to do that. That's much easier. I'm going to talk a little bit, about sort of 10, 15 minutes or so, not too long, but just give you an overview of what the book is and what the arguments are that I'm making in the book. I'm going to talk a little bit about the different conflicts that I focus on. I'm going to talk about the sort of overarching framework, this idea of that there is a quote-unquote new Middle East that I'm attempting to explain and analyse, and then I'll just run through the core argument of the book, and then we should have plenty of time for Q&A. Let me talk a little bit, first of all then, about what the book is trying to do. In many ways, this is a book that derives from a place of frustration, and for those I'm sure many in the room are who, by nature of being here, people who follow the Middle East, follow the international relations of the region, and I'm sure that you, like me, get incredibly frustrated by the quite often simplified way this quite complex region is often presented. It's presented in a simplified way often in the media, often by politicians, often by fellow academics such as myself. And because it is such a complex region, and conflict in particular in the region, but other aspects of international relations in the region are complex, far too often you find people reaching for simplified explanations, and those ones that we'll be very familiar with. There's conflict in the region because of religion. Maybe it's because of ancient hatreds between Sunnis and Shias, or Jews and Muslims. Maybe it's because of the presence of oil in the region. That's why there's so much conflict in the region. Or other simplified explanations are often down to imperialism, whether it be the legacies of European imperialism and how they carved up the Middle East in an unproductive way, or modern imperialism such as Western neo-imperialism, particularly from the United States. And these are often reasons that are utilised by, again, commentators, observers, to give these generic explanations. That is why there is conflict in this region. And what I want to do with this book is say, is to underline the fact that whilst almost all of those factors come into play, and I'm never denying that they play a role, it is next to impossible to simplify. Actually, this region is incredibly complex. And because it's complex, we shouldn't be scared of that. We shouldn't just look at this region and say, oh, it's incredibly complicated, and therefore I'm going to either disengage or I'm going to reach my simple explanation. Instead, what I believe, and what I try to do in this book, is to make that complexity accessible. Create a way of looking at the international relations of the Middle East in a relatively accessible and understandable way for people who aren't experts. So what I've tried to do in this book, and it is only an introduction, that's by its design, it's not designed to be some kind of comprehensive one-volume-fits-all approach, but it is designed to allow people who are interested in trying to understand that complexity, trying to understand why we have such a large amount of conflict in the Middle East. It gives them an opportunity to learn about those conflicts in what I believe and hope, anyway, is a relatively easy, accessible way to get started with. So what I decided to do, the way in which I tried to do that, and there's, I'm absolutely not saying this is the only way to do it. There are multiple avenues and mechanisms and frameworks by which one could start trying to explain the complexity of the international relations of the Middle East to a general audience. What I thought a good way to do it was, and I'm very open about this, borrowing from the mechanism used by Tim Marshall in Prisoners of Geography, which is to take 10 isolated incidents, or 10 isolated, in my case, conflicts or case studies, and explore them one by one. I analyse them in such a way, I present them in such a way whereby you can just read that one chapter. If you just want to learn about one particular conflict, let's say what's going on in Palestine and what's been going on in Syria or Yemen, you can just read that chapter, put the book down, never pick it up again, and that's it. Or you can read all of them in turn or in different orders and get a wider overview of what's going on in terms of conflict across the whole region. And the idea is that they do interconnect with one another, so they're not repeating each other. They tend to have a relatively similar format. They start off with a bit of history, and then they look at what's going on in recent years, and in particular what the role of inside and outside players are doing. And then sort of linking back to other cases if you're interested in what those other cases are. So what I decided to do was I decided to focus on 10 individual conflicts, but I use the word conflict not just meaning violent conflict, it might mean political conflict as well. So it might be where there's contestation within politics, even in a non-violent way. So you do have violent wars, some of my cases, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Palestine, but you also have regions and countries that have experienced war in the past, but now are seeing sort of at least less violent or sort of and sometimes non-violent contested politics. So the cases of Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt, and then I also look at some regions where again sometimes there's political contestation, sometimes there's violent contestation. Places like Kurdistan, the Gulf, and then I went a little bit further afield for my final case study to look at the Horn of Africa as well. And the common threads through all of these, and why I call the book Battleground, is that rather as I saw when I was looking at my book on the Syrian civil war, all of these conflicts share something in common, and that is multiple interventions and involvements from foreign powers. There are domestic dynamics going on the ground, and at no point do I suggest, I absolutely do not believe in any way, that the people living in these countries are proxies or puppets of outsiders, but they are intervened in and influenced by outside players. And those outside players might be regional powers, countries like Iran, which we're very aware of, countries like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, like Israel, like the UAE, but they might also be external powers from beyond the region, most notably the United States, but also I talk about Russia, China, and the European Union. And what I try to do in the book, as well as case studying these 10 conflicts, is in each chapter, each conflict, I zoom in on one of those external interveners. So in the Syria chapter, for example, there's a small section on Russia and what Russia's goals in the Middle East are. In the Egypt chapter, there's a section on the United States. On the Lebanon chapter, there's a section on the EU, for example. So the idea, again, is that once you've read through the entire book, you've got not just a sense of those 10 conflicts, but also those 10 key external interveners in these conflicts that are affecting the region. So that's the premise and the sort of the setup of the book. And in terms of what I'm trying to say, because again, there's I suppose two goals of this book. One is this introductory model, this idea of accessible complexity, the idea of allowing people that have a general interest in the Middle East to begin, let's say, on a path of beginning to understand the complexities of international relations. But there is a second point, which I'm trying to make an overall argument. I'm trying to put forward a hypothesis of why I believe the region is, or the international relations of the region are as they currently are. And that is why I call the book Conflicts That Explain the New Middle East, because I come at this with the hypothesis that actually something has changed in the region in the last few years, really sort of decade and a half, that warrants this title, The New Middle East. Something is changing, and it has affected the international relations of the region, and in fact it has made the region more conflict-ridden. And I use a little bit of data to back up this point, so I looked at, I did a sort of a slightly boring academic study of looking at past conflicts and civil wars, for example, in the Middle East, and I looked at intervention from foreign powers in civil wars in the Middle East, and I found that from the end of the Second World War to 2008, in all the civil wars that erupted in the Middle East, on average, they were intervened in directly by two powers. By two countries, on average, were getting involved in each of those conflicts. And actually, those numbers are massively skewed by two particular conflicts, which is the Lebanese Civil War and the Omani Civil War in the 1960s. Most civil wars, actually, in the region didn't attract direct foreign intervention from outsiders. But since 2008, there have been 5 conflicts that we would define as civil wars, and they have attracted, on average, 6 foreign states intervening in them each. So it's not just a slight increase, it's a massive jump in the number of foreign powers. And when I say intervention, that's actually sending their own troops in directly. We're not even just talking about sending money. It's actually like sending people in to fight, whether it's in the form of militias or your air force or special forces. So we've seen a massive increase in the level of the amount of powers being willing to intervene in conflict. So, to me, that shows that something new has happened. And I try to explain what is it, what are the structural shifts in the Middle East that have changed to justify this label, the New Middle East. And I identify 4 factors. I'll just go over them very briefly so we can sort of move into into my final sort of overarching arguments, and then we can have some questions. So, one of the major shifts in the region that has made it more conflict-ridden in recent years, really around the time of sort of 2008 onwards is the time period I focus on, is the changing role of the United States. The United States in the 1990s and 2000s, whether we agree with it or not, actively stepped into the Middle East at a higher level than it had done in the past. It took on the role of hegemon, or sort of dominant external power, and that created an environment in which whether the United States' enemies or its friends expected the US to be there. Since the failure of the invasion of, the invasion of Iraq wasn't a failure, but the Iraq conflict did not go the way that the United States wanted it to go in the long term. Since that point onwards, the US has strategically retreated. It has not withdrawn. That is a misunderstanding. It still has all its bases in the Gulf, but it is no longer acting always in that hegemonic way. And throughout the era after the Arab uprisings of 2011, we repeatedly saw question marks about the United States' role. We saw interventions in Libya, and then a decision by Obama to not follow that up with further intervention in Libya. We saw a refusal to get heavily involved in the Syria conflict. We saw a reluctance to back up Saudi Arabia with actual troops in the Yemen war. So we've seen this strategic stepping back by the United States. And importantly, even if materially the US hasn't stepped back as much as perhaps people would like or would think was going to happen, it is perceived by actors in the region as having stepped back. That is a major shift, that perception. Which brings me on to my second point, second shift. As a consequence of that, regional powers have been far more proactive in the Middle East than they were in the past. So in the past, you had one or two powers willing to act in an interventionist way in conflicts. Now multiple states, even those that previously were far more reluctant to do so, have become more involved. So Iran is the classic example. Actually, Iran, for all the sort of vilification by the United States after 1979, the Islamic Revolution, was relatively boxed in until 2003. Its enmity with Saddam Hussein meant that its regional presence, its regional footprint, was limited to its connection with Lebanon, with Hezbollah in Lebanon. After Saddam was toppled, it effectively opened the floodgates to Iranian influence in the region, and we've subsequently seen Iran get a foothold in Iraq, in Syria, Yemen, and expand its position in Lebanon. So Iran always wanted to be an activist, but it was prevented from being so. The changing position of the United States has allowed it to be more interventionist. Turkey, previously disinterested in the Middle East, after the coming to power of the AKP in Turkey in 2002, and the shifting dynamic from the United States stepping back, you have seen a more interventionist Turkey, militarily intervening in places like Syria and Libya, further afield actually off to Azerbaijan and Armenia as well, but diplomatically getting much more deeply involved in places like the Horn of Africa, like Egypt. And then Saudi Arabia, again, historically had outsourced its interventions to either Arab or external powers. So it heavily backed Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq war to protect it for its security, and then the United States in the Gulf War in the 1990s and 2000s. Once it perceived the US as stepping back, it has taken matters into its own hands. It has been far more interventionist than it was previously, getting involved in conflicts like Yemen most obviously, but also Syria and the Horn of Africa. And then two states that historically had not been very interventionist, Qatar and the UAE, use their the changing environment to step forward themselves, and both states have directly and indirectly intervened in multiple, in many of the conflicts that I'm focusing on. So that's a shift. A third shift, and all this is happening at once, and they're all interrelated and reinforcing one another, is the growth in the number of weak states in the region. Historically, in the Middle East, again, the time period I'm looking at, since the Second World War to the early 2000s, there were normally just one or two weak states, or we might say failed states in the Middle East. I don't really like the term failed state, but it's in the popular parlance. Lebanon was a weak and failed state, and after 2003, Iraq was as well. But those are the only states that had really lost control of their borders and were infiltrated frequently by foreign powers. After the Arab uprisings of 2011, we would add Yemen, Syria, and Libya to that number, and briefly Egypt, although that ended after 2013 with the launch of the coup there. So not only have you got the US stepping back from the region, and all of these regional powers and external powers as well, I didn't really talk about them, but both Russia and China changing global dynamics are more empowered and seeing the Middle East as a region where they are able to further their interests. So not only have you got these powers that want to intervene more and have the ability to intervene more, but you've suddenly got all of these arenas that have erupted, whether into a violent conflict or into a political conflict, and provide opportunities for them to play out their competitions and pursue their own interests, which is why, of course, I called the book Battleground. I could have called it Battlegrounds. There are effectively 10 battlegrounds that I'm looking at. And then related to this, a fourth shift, and again, it's all interconnected. Because of the growth of weak states, governments become much weaker, and in the vacuum you get a growth of non-state actors, fulfilling the role that was previously played by government, in terms of service provision, in terms of security provision, and of course those provide more opportunities for external powers to support them and get them to pursue their own interests. So, you have Iran supporting various different, mostly Shia militia in various regions, but you also get, for example, in the Syrian civil war, the Saudis sending money to one group, the Turks sending money to another group, the Russians sending money to another group. You see this, this opportunity is the opportunity to find allies inside these failed states is greater than when there's only one government to deal with. So these four conditions are what has changed since the mid-2000s. I talk about this in the book, very much see the 2003 Iraq War as the starting pistol for this. But there are other shifts, notably the 2008 financial crisis, the growth of China, and the US's reaction to the Arab uprisings. All of that have combined to create these four conditions which have changed the structure of the Middle East to, in my mind, make it a more conflict-ridden zone than it was before. Which brings me to my core argument. So in many ways, they're relatively simple statements, but I'll just sort of reiterate this, that the overarching theme and message of the book. The first is, conflicts, whether they're military or political, are complex. We shouldn't reduce everything to these simplified explanations, but also we shouldn't be scared of the complexity. That's one of the real problems I have with policymakers that are just like, it's too complicated, I don't want to get involved. Actually, when we break it down into understandable, I believe, accessible material, it is possible to get a head around what is often quite complex conflicts. Secondly, a point I keep reiterating, there is no such thing, in my view, as a proxy. There are internal actors that have their own domestic, legitimate issues and grievances. Often they might align very heavily with outside actors, particularly the case of Iran and some of its allies. But reducing domestic actors to puppets is unhelpful and, in my view, incorrect. What the book is often writing about is an interaction between internal and external forces. And that's a key to understanding the international relations of the Middle East. It's about that interaction. It's not just about proxies acting on behalf of external actors, and in the same way, it's not just external actors following whatever domestic players want them to do. It's an interaction. It's about its nature. And then the final kind of wider geopolitical point, the point that I keep coming back to, is that actually, whether rightly or wrongly, the United States remains absolutely key to understanding what's going on in the international relations of the region. In the sense that even though it's no longer no longer sort of like the hegemon or the undisputed dominant actor, if it ever was, it is still the most powerful player, and we're seeing this with the Gaza conflict now. It's still playing this leading role on certain areas. And I'm not saying for a moment that the US is removing itself from the region. However, it is perceived to be different and less engaged and less involved than it was at, let's say, the height of what we call the unipolar moment or US dominance right after the Cold War in the 1990s and early 2000s. As a final kind of policy point, and I make this point in the conclusion of the book, some people might therefore conclude that actually, given that the US stepping back from the region has led to a spike in conflict, therefore the US should just step back forward and return to this hegemonic role. I don't argue that. I actually argue that if we're to criticise the United States, it was for stepping forward in the first place. Actually, its role in stepping up in the late 1980s and early 90s into 2000s and trying to play this hegemonic role actually contributed to a massive imbalance in the Middle East. Arguably, it's not sustainable for any external actor, whether it's the US or Russia, or Soviet Union in the past, or China in the future, to play this kind of dominant role, especially when you've got a domestic constituency, as the United States does, that really isn't that interested in playing that role. So at some point, a retreat was always going to happen. And this, circumstances that I'm describing, I don't want to say it was inevitable, but there was an increased chance of that happening when the US did eventually step back, and it has happened. So I don't make the argument that what we need is a return to US dominance. Actually, it's more that it may take a lot of time, and unfortunately it might be bloody to a point, and I'm not happy about that, but there is an element to which the regional powers themselves need to find a way, to use the words of Barack Obama, learning to share the region. That is a very difficult prospect, and it's certainly not something that I, as a mere academic, am going to sort of work out how you do that. But in terms of the kind of structure and the nuts and bolts of how the region looks, that to me is a more plausible future for the Middle East than just a return to a US hegemony, which arguably didn't even work in the first place. Thank you.